Hi, I'm Rebecca Carbin, principal at Art Plus Public Unlimited. And this is a new video series where Art Plus Public Unlimited has teamed up with Canadian Art Forecast to bring you a behind-the-scenes look at Canadian artist practices. And we're excited about sharing this series with you and discussing the many working methods of artists. Today, I'm joined by Mark Clintberg to chat about recent exhibitions, past work, future projects, and common threads of concern that run through his practice. In particular, Mark's work has a way of highlighting the interconnection of various disciplines associated with art, the ephemerality of what we think of as monumental, and the presence or presentation of love and desire in public, all things that are very dear to my heart. His research interests include installation, artist cinema, edible art practices, sensory design in museums, and queer theory. He's an assistant professor at the Alberta University of the Arts. Mark was shortlisted for the 2013 Soviet Art Award for the Prairies and North regions, and his doctoral dissertation was nominated for the 2013 Governor General's Gold Medal Award. His work is held in public and private collections across Canada and the United States, including the National Gallery of Canada, a work called Love Empire, which was acquired when he was still a student at Concordia University. And we'll hopefully get a chance to talk about that work in this conversation. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today and to Mark sharing some of the thinking process behind his body of work with our art lovers. Mark, thanks so much for joining us and for opening your studio up to us, even if virtually.
It's my pleasure, Rebecca. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me to do this.
So in a past interview, you mentioned that you thought of your art history research as braided into your studio practice. And I love this idea of a sort of intertwining and symbiosis between research into what has been made and the process of making itself. It's something present for every artist, but for you, it's very purposeful and intentional. Can you speak a bit to your practice of research, art historical as well as historical archive in your work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about research lately, in part because I'm about to go on sabbatical. And of course, research and, the outcomes of research are very much a part of what I want to be thinking about during that time away. I suppose that for me, a key question about research and its connection to my studio practice, it's basically this fundamental question that I asked myself in an abstract way, not deliberately, as a teenager growing up in Alberta, as a cis queer person growing up in a relatively small town that was pretty intensely homophobic, and really like thinking about how that town was organized and run. It's like an instrument of the patriarchy, for lack of a better way of putting it. And yeah, I mean, growing up, a key question that I wondered about was, is there anybody else like me? And I think that a lot of people wonder that, especially people who are marginalized because of their sexuality or their gender and the expression of those identities. And, feeling unsafe growing up was really a fundamental feeling for me. And, wondering is there anybody else who's like me? And, seeing some media representation, seeing some older people from Edmonton that I kind of was introduced to who somehow identified as not heteronormative in one way or another. I suppose that gave me some hope, but it also sparked a kind of curiosity. An impulse, I guess, that's fundamental to this is that I wanted to learn about other people and, not just histories that are exclusively about my own identity, but other forms of identity that have been pushed to the margins. So I suppose that this braiding together is kind of, it's kind of the outcome of my feeling after finishing my PhD, which was an extremely positive experience on the whole. And, thinking about ways that my research practice and the interest that I have in art history could come together with what I do in the studio. And so very often what that means is researching and learning about other artistic practices, very often from the past, often from the 60s, and kind of like movements or artists associated with the neo-avant-garde, and wondering about how we can return to some of those strategies, come back to some of those strategies, and, in some cases critique them or question them, but also learn from them. And that impulse really comes from a desire for the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and histories.
Recent talk with Crystal Mowry in December around your exhibition portals at Latitude 53. You mentioned archives as a place to seek connection, and you used a phrase that really struck me. You called them sort of a touch across time, finding out a way of finding out about ancestors, beloveds. And I first came across your work in coverage about the National Gallery acquiring your piece Love Empire in 2005, which was a very DIY stage built expressly for enabling proclamations of love. And love and desire for connection are recurring themes and concerns across at least 15 years of your practice. Can you speak to this braiding of like intellectual pursuit, the research and kind of looking into those kind of historical accounts with also this exploration of needs for or modes of emotional connection, especially in those kind of public spaces?
Hmm. Yeah, what a great question. And this notion of the touch across time, which comes from the writing of Carolyn Dinshaw, has been important, I think, for a lot of people doing research into recessive histories. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you bring up Love Empire in connection to that notion of the touch across time, because uh, yeah, that's a work that I made for the Alberta Biennial in 2005. It was commissioned for that exhibition. The idea is that it's this DIY, very basic carpentry project that invites people to make declarations of love to something or someone. And at that time, I was really wondering, like, am I going to stay here? Is there a reason for me to stay? And I suppose a question about that, that question had to do with fear and feeling afraid a lot. I mean, I think that in some ways situations have changed in the province, but at that time, walking down a major city street with bars and restaurants and so on, I was continually afraid. So getting back to this question about the touch across time, I was thinking, okay, can I stay here? I'm just going to make this object that gives me an opportunity to say some of the things that I want to say personally. And sort of by coincidence, it also gives some other people the opportunity to say the things that they want to say. So this was a time when the matter of same-sex marriage was like one of the big political questions that was being pushed forward on behalf of many people who are non-heteronormative. And that question really overshadowed a lot of other political and social issue questions that are very important, like issues that were highlighted in the 60s and 70s in the gay and lesbian liberation movements that occurred in different parts of the world, including things like accessible education, housing security, food security. And this question of same-sex union seemed to kind of trump all of those other matters in the early 2000s, at least in my own context. And yeah, I mean, it's not that I thought, okay, I'm going to make this stage and it's going to be a replacement for same-sex union and people will just get to declare their love and they can leave it at that. But it really was a statement about my own dis-ease around that being like the fundamental political question that was being pursued by many people. So the touch across time again here is that somehow this object, this sculpture, Love Empire, ends up being, I hope, like a conduit and point of connection for many different people who encounter that work and are put in a position where, they're asked to consider, am I with somebody right now where I would want to do this? And if not, is that a problem? The work poses that question about what it means to make that emotional touch with somebody else. Why do we pursue that? And why does it need to be public? What's important there?
In previous conversations, and actually kind of referred to a little bit here about textile in your work, either kind of referring to braiding or knitting, but also you have worked with textiles, and particularly the most recent exhibit at Latitude 53. We've talked about it both as a medium and as an industry. and as a sort of proxy for collective history. So it plays a key role in concerns presented in your recent show. And I feel like in that show, clothing almost becomes a form of archive or monument, but a radical rethink of what a monument can be. It's something that is formed with a pattern, but can be modified and adapted as times change. It's something that many hands are involved in creating, and specifically to textiles and distributing, but in monuments more distributing the narrative of it, I guess. And it's something that holds the mark, or even in the case of textiles, the scent of someone who has worn it or lived it. And Crystal Mowry again wrote a beautiful essay for your recent show for Portal at Latitude 53. She says, she said, you've always had a troubled relationship with the monumental has prepared you for living as though you are always merely passing through, which I find that sentence has really stuck with me. These ideas of monumental and ephemerality are, I feel, things that are also present in a push and pull way throughout your practice. Can you speak a little bit to the piece that was in that show, Proposal for Monument 3, After Night Movements, and sort of relate it to our discussion around monumentality and ephemerality?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, I'm so grateful to Crystal for writing that text, because it really gave me new tools even for thinking about my work. And this notion of being resigned to passing through, I mean, that just feels so true to me. And I mean, maybe to a reader, there might be something that is so mournful, and maybe there's pathos in that, but I think there's also something that is very, very beautiful and fundamental to human experience and mortality, obviously. A very evocative way of thinking about how monuments function themselves, because all monuments are merely passing through.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even the figures of the past that are being challenged and should be challenged right now. And you know, some of them have been pulled down. Many of them have been challenged, meaningfully altered through different activist actions and protests in the last year, especially, but over the course of many years. And I think that this points out that any form of monumentality, it's simply passing through, and that it exists in a certain moment, and then it goes through a series of transitions around its reception. And I mean, there are so many different people writing about these notions of monumentality. I mean, Mi Wan Kwan is somebody that's really helped me to think about the shifting receptions of public art and art in public space. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that returning to your question about passing through and that Proposal for Monument series of photos, I should mention that they're a direct response to the work of Anthony Carro. The process was basically this. I found a photograph through the research of Kevin Allen that showed a jacket that had been found at the site of a murder in 1979. And I'll really quickly recount the story. A group of men were cruising for sex at Central Memorial Park, which is just a few blocks from where I live now, one night in 1979. And this homophobic man showed up and started threatening people in the park. And so two young men, who I believe one of them was 19, the other one was 20, they chased this homophobic man out of the park and they murdered him. And at the site of that murder, there was a silver jacket, a bomber jacket that was found, and it was one of the pieces of evidence that was profiled by the media in the really salacious and scandalous coverage of this event. And so this jacket for me ended up being not just a piece of evidence, but also sort of functioned like a surrogate. So I just thought, okay, I want to get into further contact with this context. And I think it's important that I'm really honest about why, because it's uncomfortable. Why? And the reason is because when I heard about this story on a deep level, I felt vindicated. And that feels horrible to say, because I don't think that threatening man deserved to die. But nonetheless, somehow I felt like, okay, people, my kind of people, standing up for themselves, protecting themselves, and you know, if you come to our house, so to speak, and you threaten us, there will be consequences. As a young person, I frequently read the Edmonton Journal, which my family had a subscription to, in part because I was looking for news stories that were about people like me, people that that don't identify as straight. And the stories, for the most part, that I ended up reading were about people who died by suicide, or about people who were murdered or assaulted. You know, they were stories that were deeply traumatic and very upsetting, and you know, did nothing to kindle a sense of security
Purity, yeah.
about my identity. It actually just further frightened me. And so this story has a very different outcome than the one that was usually profiled in the news sources that I was consulting. So although I didn't encounter this history until I guess like my late 30s, it it marked me somehow, because it gave me the tools to think about that history in a different way. Again, like, I don't feel good about that feeling of vindication. I'm not thinking like, wow, you know, this is the ideal outcome, but rather that the tragedy of the situation, it also connects to a sense of vulnerability that I think that many people feel in public space. So returning to your question, Central Memorial Park, where the events that led to this murder began, is a park full of monuments. Most of them are monuments to different military conflicts that are tied to the history of colonialism. That is what is monumentalized in this park. And I hope that I will end up being wrong about this, but so far in my research, I haven't been able to find an example of a monument or memorial inside of what we call the province of Alberta that is a monument or memorial to somebody who is not heterosexual. That there isn't, that I have found, a monument or memorial that ties to non-heteronormative histories. And I'm not talking about something like painting a rainbow on a crosswalk, okay? Like, that's not what I mean. So now, although this does sadden me, it's not that I think that we should now go out and make, you know, like a massive monument to Windy Earthworm, for instance, who's a really interesting figure in the histories of this region. I don't think that that's the solution, but questioning monuments is another way of dealing with that. Instead of just making a monument, then why not question the monuments that are right? So I am coming to this title of the work, Night Movements. It's part of the title of that photographic series. And that's also the title of work by Anthony Carro. And Carro is important in the region's history because he was very influential on a generation, really, of artists, sculptors working in and around the center of Alberta, and a number of artists that were associated with the University of Alberta through their teaching practices. So Carro and his work ended up shaping how many artists, or I should say influencing how many artists made sculpture in Alberta. And so we see a lot of work, a lot of public artwork that looks similar to Carro's work. I'm not saying
language, yeah.
It's like this large scale welded metal sculpture. And you know, anybody who has been to this part of the world, you know, if you haven't noticed this before, now you're going to start seeing that it really is all over the place. I would say more so north of where I am than in the city that I live in. And I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. I'm not saying, like, no disrespect to people that have picked up on Anthony Carro's aesthetic, but rather that this aesthetic ends up being kind of like a marker of public art in this region. And so getting back to the bomber jacket, in the process of making these replicas or these near facsimiles of that bomber jacket that was found, I started to notice that the pattern pieces really looked like fragments of an Anthony Carro. And as I was laying them out on the table, I was like, well, you know, this looks like a silhouette of a Carro. And then I just started experimenting with stapling the pieces together, using tape to tape it all together. And then I thought, wow, this does look like a public artwork, and it looks like a really, junky, pathetic monument, a
Yeah.
maquette for a public artwork. I just had a bunch of cardboard boxes lying around from, like one was from ordering my new laptop, another one was from a work of printed matter, a sample that I'd ordered. And this just ended up making the base for these public.
Plinth. Yeah.
Yeah, they're the plinth. The cardboard box is the plinth. And I mean, I just thought like, these objects are so humiliating. They're so humiliating. And again, I mean, it's not that I think that everyone in the region should know this history, but rather that there are so many histories like this that very few people do know, and many of them that I don't know. There are thousands, if not millions, of important histories like this that are recessive, that are not located in the archive. And that's why research like what Kevin Allen has been doing, which is oral history research, where he interviews people, that's why that's so important. Archival work is really important too, but we also need to talk to people before these histories kind of disappear.
I understand you have kind of a connection to the Art Gallery of Alberta as a place that you would have gone to as a young person. And there was this sort of wall work with barn board that read, "Behind this lies my true desire for you." A sound piece called Quiet Disco, and then a piece called Frottage. And what I thought, I'm really interested in how you set these three pieces up. So the "Behind this lies my true desire for you" is this sort of invitation to discover some salacious secret that's behind this kind of open door. And that is sort of underscored by the soundtrack from Quiet Disco, which is this kind of muffled bass. Sounds like there's a party going on that you're missing out on, and want to kind of be part of. But then you go into the door, you go through the door, through that work, and you're confronted with Frottage, which is actually this quiet, mournful, I would say mournful, maybe you wouldn't, practice of taking a rubbing, usually from a gravestone. And so there's this, and the two pieces that you can write, the rubbings that you can do, either say, "I've taken a rubbing of this and hung it in my window because I have forgotten you, even though you are still in love with me," or you can opt to take the "I have taken a rubbing of this and hung it in my window because I am still in love with you, even though you have forgotten me." So I'm really interested, this piece, or these three pieces together, weave together this kind of really complicated relationship between the eternal and monumental, like the gravestone and the dead, with this very ephemeral scribbled piece of paper, that I know certainly I've done these on gravestones and I have not kept track of them. I've lost them. I don't know why I did them in the first place, because I don't bother keeping them. So they're really, really ephemeral, and yet they're completely tied to each other.
It's so wonderful to hear you describe that work. It's a really rich description for one thing, but it also takes me back to that installation, which was just so enjoyable to put together. So "Behind This Lies My True Desire for You" was first made for the Art Gallery of Alberta. And then the installation that you described was actually at the Illingworth Kerr Gallery in Calgary, curated by Tatiana Melema. And I'm so glad you brought up the AGA as an important institution in my formation as an artist, because I remember the very first show that I saw there that really mattered to me was an exhibition of the work of Stan Douglas, who continues to be an important artist for me in terms of thinking about recessive histories and also a degree of fabulation and how those histories are represented. And in response to your question, I mean, I think that the notion of the study is really important, because with those frottage works, which, they really do replicate the experience of taking rubbings of gravestones, they are, the act of making them is the important part. And I don't actually expect that very many people end up putting them in their windows. It's about the study element of making them and thinking carefully about this message that appears gradually, even though you've read it on that bronze casting before you make the rubbing. It sort of appears to you as you rub it. And I think that making those words appear is an important act in terms of studying what feels true for us. Because of course, like, nobody who makes a rubbing of something that claims they've forgotten someone has actually forgotten that. That's part of the message of this work, is that I think that often we are haunted by people that we have known. And I can't even call them people from our past, because I really think that, you know, this notion of the past, it's a very limited way of thinking of the world. And I'm much more interested in thinking about, you know, past, present, and future as more like a continuum, I guess. I think that's a much more productive way of thinking of it. So each of these works are about that kind of continuum. And like with Behind This Lies My True Desire for You, you know, from the outside, like you said, it's this sort of salacious promise, like, oh, finally, I'm going to understand what that person's desire is. Maybe it's the artist's desire, maybe it's somebody else's desire. But when you walk through that door, the first impression is that you've just walked into a very large empty room. I mean, I think it's got to be 2,000 square feet of what seems to be just empty space. And there are these very small pieces. I mean, they're about this big.
Is
that
it
are,
dark in that space, or was it?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
there are these little point lights that point at
That's what I
the
imagine. Yeah.
yeah, that are embedded into the drywall. But really, it's like this cavernous space, and acoustically, the effect of quiet disco just reinforces that. 2013, quiet disco played during the opening, and I can almost guarantee that nobody that was hearing that for the first time imagined that this was an artwork. They're just thinking, oh, this is the party music for the opening.
Yeah.
But yeah, this work, when it's installed in a gallery, I think it sort of provokes the sense that there's a party happening in the prep room or in the curatorial offices or somewhere else, that the party is somewhere else. And that the excitement is always on the horizon. It's always somewhere else. The activity is always somewhere else. And I think that loops back to where we started.
Yes, exactly.
Conversation, that it's like, you know, queerness for me growing up, I always imagined that that was something that was happening somewhere else. And that seemed like a really negative thing. But now, at this point in my life, I'm interested in the generative possibilities of that. If we, you know, learn from people like Jose Esteban Munoz, who tell us that queerness is something that's always on the horizon, it's always aspirational, and it is somewhere else because it's not something that we achieve. Because queerness is about, you know, questioning the solidity and fixity of sexuality and gender. It's about not being content to accept the definition of what that even is. It's about always going into new understandings of what that is, that it changes every day. You know, Judith Butler tells us that sexuality and gender shift in time and space.
It does bring us right back to the beginning of the conversation, and also to how we've talked about reframing the idea of more monumental practices or institutional practices as well, and thinking about opening those up, or considering, you know, pieces that have been outside and how we bring those in and reshape how we're talking about monuments or collective histories or collecting. Do you want to talk about that experience of bringing your practice into a public artwork, and whether you've got what else you have on the horizon, either in that field or other than sabbatical next year?
Yes, yeah.
Which is very exciting.
Public art is its own form. It's not just a different format, it's its own form. And I think the way that you've approached the question, I think it's really apt to what many artists experience, which I think that many artists who work in public art and also have other forms of expression often think of these two things as being quite distinct from one another. And this is a case where, yeah, I mean, that feels right to me. I think that there are big differences. I'm not saying that public art isn't part of my artistic practice, but it's so different. I mean, it's different logistically, like working with a civil engineer and an architect and an art consultant and the client's board, you know, like this is something I've done a few times now. And every time it's its own version of bureaucracy. And I don't mean that disrespectfully to any of the institutions or people that I've worked with on public art projects. It's just part of how it is, because there are so many interests and there are so many stakeholders involved. And it's not a matter of me going to the studio and making something and then afterward somebody coming along and saying, oh yeah, I'll take that, wrap it up. You know, it's much more complex than that. Although in some cases, you know, works that are displayed publicly of mine have been that process where it's like, well, I made something and then someone decided to sort of turn it into a publicly visible art. But here, I mean, I'm really with Rosalind Deutsch and her ideas around how we define public art. And there are many different ways of identifying and defining public art, but I really like her notion of thinking about publicness, and that, you know, just because something is displayed in a public space does not necessarily make it resonant to a public. And yeah, and I'm most interested in forms of public art that address this notion of publicness. And basically the idea is, you know, what is public space? Who has the right to be there? Whose voices are amplified there? Whose voices are welcomed? What histories and legacies are honored in those spaces? How are they manifested? How are they represented? And, you know, I'm not going to basically go into my like art history teaching mode here and say, well, in case study A, in case study B, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure we can all imagine different cases that fail to, works of public art that fail to reckon with publicness, with their role in defining public space, and then other artworks that do that extremely effectively and really study how public space is constructed. So I suppose that in my works of public art, the way that I've thought about publicness in Deutsch's terms is to think about what forms of expression are appropriate in public space and what forms of are considered inappropriate, and by, you know, by what parties are those expressions considered appropriate or inappropriate. And part of that, I think, is about defining what needs to be expressed in public. You know, thinking about a work from that's in the collection of the Alberta Foundation of the Arts, which is called Meet Me in the Woods. That was really the first artwork that I did that could be defined as a public artwork, both in terms of it being publicly visible in public space, but also in terms of thinking through publicness. Because the way that it works is that it's a message that has been added to the back of a sign for the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Centre. And there are two messages. One says, meet me in the town, and one says, meet me in the woods. And I mean, for anybody who's been at the Banff Centre doing a residency or even just visiting, it is a profoundly public place. You are always on display as an artist there, either to your peers or to other visitors. Even if you have a private studio, it's very hard to be alone there. It's very hard to find time and space to be alone or apart, or to seek intimacy with one other person for that matter. And so the solution always seemed to be that you either had to leave campus and go into the woods, or leave campus and go into the town site. And those are the two options. But of course, you know, Banff as a place and as a national park is very much a construction, and it's a construction of colonization. It's a construction in terms of notions of the natural, and this divide between town and woods is completely artificial. I mean, it's one of the signs is on the property line between the Banff Centre campus and the town of Banff. Like we did like this survey to try and find that exact line. And it was important to kind of demarcate that and say like, well, clearly this is an artificial distinction. Anyhow, getting back to the matter of publicness, you know, this work, I think, raises questions not just about where emotional connection happens, but also where feeling is. Like, where is feeling located? One of the people involved in the project early on said, Mark, is this work about gay sex? I just have to know if this is about public sex. Like, is this about public sex? And, you know, I think that is a part
of public sex.
Pardon?
It's kind of like, well, do you think it's about public sex? That idea of publicness is who's interpreting, you know, who and how people interpret the work as well, right? Is knowing the audience is going to be part of it. Yeah.
Well, in an artist talk, I raised this anecdote, and someone in the audience said, "Straight people have sex in the woods too." And yeah, I mean, to that point, I don't think that it's about one form of expression. It's about marking forms of meeting that are already taking place and just drawing attention to the validity of those forms of meeting, whether they are sexual, erotic, or otherwise. And yeah, I mean that these definitions of what is appropriate in public space are things that have been agreed upon by people that have a degree of power over such things. And yeah, and that is up to us to question or to challenge.
Even the sex conversation right now, when you're talking about what is and is not allowed in public space and what kind of encounters you can have, that feels like such a timely thing to be thinking about right now, as we've all been told to not have any encounters in public, and we're increasingly in these cities where people will kind of avoid, you know, even sharing a sidewalk with people, and there's changing rules about how many people you can pull together in a situation. And so that idea of who, how we define, you know, what the parameters are for defining acceptable and unacceptable public behavior
Mhm.
has really been pushed in this current climate under one pretext. But it's interesting to think about what's being established in terms of how those expectations are set up for future, when we get to determine who gets to determine what an acceptable gathering is in terms of numbers, or who is getting together and that sort of thing. It's a bit it's become a conversation that is now more even just part of the central, you know, normative experience of public life, is like how many people are allowed to be there. Yeah.
I look forward to a day when someone listens to this interview and they think, oh, this part of the interview is so periodized.
Yeah,
It's
me
so
too.
specific, you know, that this seems so alien. I really look forward to that day. But for the moment, picking up on this theme, I mean, this is so deeply felt right now. And in my own context, for instance, I could go to a restaurant or a bar without a mask and sit at a separate table from other people. But of course, in practice, what's happening is that people from many households are gathering in bars and restaurants, no mask, drinking with each other. But I cannot visit my own family, and I cannot go into the home of any of the people that I love. And if that
Mhm.
doesn't underscore the arbitrary nature of the distinction between public and private space, I don't know what does. Like, we are really, the full contours of those arbitrary uh, definitions are being sounded right now. And yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that right now is a moment of mass trauma. We're all experiencing this trauma in different ways and at different levels, according to many different factors. But I look forward to a time when we can gather and we can kind of, yeah, question and critique the how these boundaries have been defined and
Mhm.
what our plan is for the future.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent place to end.
I think so
And I
too.
think thank you for talking so candidly and thoroughly and thoughtfully about your practice.